The Project Gutenberg e-book of Parmenides, the Grand Duke of Parma, by Plato. This e-book is for the use of anyone, anywhere, at no cost, and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away, or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. Gutenberg is spelled Gutenberg. Title Parmenides. Author Plato. Translator Benjamin Jowett. Release date of this edition November 3rd, 2008, ebook number 1687. Last update January 15, 2013. Language English. Start of this Project Gutenberg ebook Parmenides. Produced by Sue Asjar and David Widger. Parmenides. Read by Christopher Robert Neal, Esquire. The Grand Duchy of Parma, now in the nation or country of Italy, is within my family, and I, as well as others, are eligible to assume the role if called upon. So I will take that on in reading Parmenides by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. Contents, introduction and analysis, and then Parmenides. Introduction and analysis. The awe with which Plato regarded the character of the great Parmenides has extended to the dialogue which he calls by his name. None of the writings of Plato have been more copiously illustrated, both in ancient and modern times, and in none of them have the interpreters been more at variance with one another. Nor is this surprising, for the Parmenides is more fragmentary and isolated than any other dialogue, and the design of the writer is not expressly stated. The date is uncertain. The relation to the other writings of Plato is also uncertain. The connection between the two parts is at first sight extremely obscure, and in the latter of the two we are left in doubt as to whether Plato is speaking of his own sentiments by the lips of Parmenides and overthrowing him out of his own mouth, or whether he is propounding consequences which would have been admitted by Zeno and Parmenides themselves. The contradictions which follow from the hypotheses of the one and many have been regarded by some as transcendental mysteries, by others as a mere illustration taken at random of a new method. They seem to have been inspired by a sort of dialectical frenzy, such as may be supposed to have prevailed in the Megarian school, compare Cratylus, etc. The criticism of his own doctrine of ideas has also been considered not as a real criticism, but as an exuberance of the metaphysical imagination which enabled Plato to go beyond himself. To the latter part of the dialogue, we may certainly apply the words in which he himself describes the earlier philosophers and the sophists. They went on their way rather regardless of whether we understood them or not. The Parmenides in point of style is one of the best of the Platonic writings. The first portion of the dialogue is in no way defective in ease and grace and dramatic interest, nor in the second part, where there was no room for such qualities, is there any want for clearness or precision. The latter half is an exquisite mosaic, of which the small pieces are with the utmost fineness and regularity adapted to one another. Like the Protagoras, Phaedo, and others, the whole is a narrated dialogue combining with the mere recital of the words spoken, the observations of the reciter on the effect produced by them. Thus, we are informed by him that Zeno and Parmenides were not altogether pleased at the request of Socrates that they would examine into the nature of the one and many in the sphere of ideas, although they received his suggestion with approving smiles. And we are glad to be told that Parmenides was aged but well favored, and that Zeno was very good looking, and that Parmenides affected to decline the great argument on which, as Zeno knew from experience, he was not unwilling to enter. The character of Antiphon, the half brother of Plato, who had once been inclined to philosophy, but has now shown the hereditary disposition for horses, is very naturally described. He is the sole depositary of the famous dialogue. But although he receives the strangers like a courteous gentleman, he is impatient of the trouble of reciting it. As they enter, he has been giving orders to a bridle maker. By this slight touch, Plato verifies the previous description of him. After a little persuasion, he is induced to favor the Clazomenians, or the Clazomenians, who come from a distance with a rehearsal. Respecting the visit of Zenu and Parmenides to Athens, we may observe, first, that such a visit is consistent with dates and may possibly have occurred. Secondly, that Plato is very likely to have invented the meeting. You, Socrates, can easily invent Egyptian tales or anything else. Phaedrus. Thirdly, that no reliance can be placed on the circumstances as determining the date of Parmenides and Zeno. Fourthly, that the same occasion appears to be referred to by Plato in two other places, Theaet and Soph. Many interpreters have regarded the Parmenides as a reductio ad absurdum of the Eleatic philosophy, but would Plato have been likely to place this in the mouth of the great Parmenides himself, who appeared to him in Homeric language to be venerable and awful, and to have a glorious depth of mind? Theat, Theat. It may be admitted that he has ascribed to an Eleatic stranger in the sophist opinions which went beyond the doctrines of the Eleatics, but the Eleatic stranger expressly criticizes the doctrines in which he had been brought up. He admits that he is going to lay hands on his father Parmenides. Nothing of this kind is said of Zeno and Parmenides. How then, without a word of explanation, could Plato assign to them the refutation of their own tenets? The conclusion at which we must arrive is that the Parmenides is not a refutation of the Eleatic philosophy, nor would such an explanation afford any satisfactory connection of the first and second parts of the dialogue, and it is quite inconsistent with Plato's own relation to the Eleatics, for of all the pre Socratic philosophers, he speaks of them with the greatest respect. But he could but he could hardly have passed upon them a more unmeaning slight than to ascribe to their great master tenets the reverse of those which he actually held. Two preliminary remarks must be made. Two preliminary remarks may be made. First, that whatever latitude we may allow to Plato in bringing together by a tour de force, as in the Phaedrus, dissimilar themes, yet he always in some way seeks to find a connection for them. Many threads joined together in one, the love and dialectic of the Phaedrus. We cannot conceive the great artist would place in juxtaposition two absolutely divided and incoherent subjects, and hence we are led to make a second remark, viz., that no explanation of the Parmenides can be satisfactory which does not indicate the connection of the first and second parts. To suppose that Plato would first go out of his way to make Parmenides attack the Platonic ideas and then proceed to a similar but more fatal assault on his own doctrine of being appears to be the height of absurdity. Perhaps there is no message in Plato showing greater metaphysical power than that in which he assails his own theory of ideas. The arguments are nearly, if not quite, those of Aristotle. They are the objections which naturally occur to a modern student of philosophy. Many persons will be surprised to find Plato criticizing the very conceptions which have been supposed in after ages to be peculiarly characteristic of him. How can he have placed himself so completely without them? How can he have ever persisted in them after seeing the fatal objections which might be urged against them? The consideration of this difficulty has led a recent critic, Ibeveg, who in general accepts the authorized canon of the Platonic writings, to condemn the Parmenides as spurious. The accidental want of external evidence at first sight seems to favor this opinion. In answer, it might be sufficient to say that no ancient writing of equal length and excellence is known to be spurious, nor is the silence of Aristotle to be hastily assumed. There is at least a doubt whether his use of the same arguments does not involve the inference that he knew the work. And if the Parmenides is spurious, like Überweg, we are led on further than we originally intended to pass a similar condemnation of the Thea et Etus and Sophist, and therefore on the Politicus, compare Theo et Etus and Sophist. But the objection is in reality fanciful, and rests on the assumption that the doctrine of the ideas was held by Plato throughout his life in the same form. For the truth is that the Platonic ideas were in constant process of growth and transmutation, sometimes veiled in poetry and mythology, then again emerging as fixed ideas in some passages regarded as absolute and eternal, and in others as relative to the human mind, existing in and derived from external objects as well as transcending them. The The ananesis of the idea is chiefly insisted upon in the mythical portion of the dialogues and really occupies a very small space in the entire works of Plato. Anamnesis is a noun. The first definition is recollection in particular. The second, from New Oxford American Dictionary, the remembering of things from a supposed previous existence, often used with reference to Platonic philosophy. The third, in medicine, a patient's account of a medical history. The fourth, in the Christian Church, the part of the Eucharist in which the passion, resurrection, and ascension of Christ are recalled. Its origin is the late 16th century, from the Greek ananesis, which means remembrance. So that sentence again. The ananesis of the ideas is chiefly insisted upon in the mythical portions of the dialogues and really occupies a very small space in the entire works of Plato. Their transcendental existence is not asserted and is therefore implicitly denied in the Philebus. Different forms are ascribed to them in the Republic, and they are mentioned in the Thea et Etus, the Sophist, the Politicus, and the Laws, much as universals would be spoken of in modern books Indeed, there are very faint traces of the transcendental doctrines of ideas, that is, of their existence apart from the mind, in any of Plato's writings, with the exceptions of Meno, the Phaedrus, the Phaedo, and in portions of the Republic. The stereotyped form which Aristotle has given to them is not found in Plato. Compare Essay on the Platonic Ideas in the introduction to the Meno. The full discussion of this subject involves a comprehensive survey of the philosophy of Plato, which would be out of place here. But without digressing further from the immediate subject of the Parmenides, we may remark that Plato is quite serious in his objections to his own doctrines, nor does Socrates attempt to offer any answer to them. The perplexities which surround the one and many in the sphere of the ideas are also alluded to in the Phaedrus, and no answer is given to them. Nor have they ever been answered, nor can they be answered by anyone else who separates the phenomenal from the real. To suppose that Plato, at a later period of his life, reached a point of view from which he was able to answer them is a groundless assumption. The real progress of Plato's own mind has been partly concealed from us by the dogmatic statements of Aristotle, and also by the degeneracy of his own followers, with whom a doctrine of numbers quickly superseded ideas. As a preparation for answering some of the difficulties which have been suggested, we may begin by sketching the first portion of the dialogue. Cephalus, Peter, of Clazomene in Ionia, the birthplace of Anaxagoras, a citizen of no mean city in the history of philosophy, who is the narrator of the dialogue, describes himself as meeting Adeimantus and Glaucon in the Agora at Athens. Why do I trip over Anaxagoras? Because I'm thinking of Anaxerxes, the emperor of Persia. Welcome, Cephalus, and Cephas, as the name given by Jesus Peter. Cephalus, Cephas meaning rock, Cephalus meaning head. So in the name Peter, rock, is the concept of being a blockhead. It's a potential insult. Welcome, Cephalus. Can we do anything for you in Athens? Why, yes, I came to ask a favor of you. First, tell me your half brother's name, which I have forgotten. He was a mere child when I was last here. I know his father's, which is Pyro Empis, he who increases the amplitude of the fire. Yes, and the name of our brother is Antiphon, he who stops all speech or stops hearing. But why do you ask? Let me introduce you to some countrymen of mine who are lovers of philosophy. They have heard that Antiphon remembers a conversation of Socrates with Parmenides and Zeno, of which the report came to him from Pythodoros, Zeno's friend. Pythodoros, uh, he who is rich with Dorian columns is a possibility, or he who is or has a large dork. That is quite true. And can they hear the dialogue? Nothing easier. In the days of his youth, he made a careful study of the piece. At present, his thoughts have another direction. He takes after his grandfather and has given up philosophy for horses. We went to look for him and found him giving instructions to a worker in brass about bridle. When he had done with him, he had learned from his brothers the purpose of our visit. He saluted me as an old acquaintance, and we asked him to repeat the dialogue. At first he complained of the trouble, but he soon consented. He told us that Pythodorus had described to him the appearance of Parmenides and Zeno. They had come to Athens at the great Panathe- Panathenaea, the former being at the time about 65 years old, aged but well favored Zeno, who was said to have been beloved of Parmenides in the days of his youth, about 40, and very good looking. That they lodged with Pythodorus at the Ceramicus outside the wall, whither Socrates, then a very young man, came to see them. Zeno was reading one of his theses, which he had nearly finished, when Pythodorus entered with Parmenides and Aristoteles, who was thereafter one of the 30. So, uh, Panathenaea, the great Panathenaea, the worship of the goddess Athena in all of her forms. As Athena, as Artemis, as Arosa, and other forms that she may appear. So the worship of the great goddess. Uh, Aristoteles, uh, Aristos, is a high-ranking individual, a prince or a court, a duke or someone similar in high rank. And Thales, he who appears to be aristocratic, you could say. In one of the 30s, there are at least the Decembre, those who meet in December. They are a group of 10 very high ranking Roman individuals. The 30 would be another rank of individuals, and they are 30 in number, and again, very high ranking individual, which would go with his name, Aristoteles. When the recitation was completed, Socrates requested that the first thesis of the treatise might be read again. You mean, Zenu, said Socrates, to argue that being, if it is many, you mean, Zenu, said Socrates, to argue that being, if it is many, must be both like and unlike, which is a contradiction. And each division of your argument is intended to elicit a similar absurdity which may be supposed to follow from the assumption that being is many. Such is my meaning. So I'm going to stop there, or else we'll go down a rabbit hole. You should understand that when Socrates asks a question, he does not mean I know the answer, and in my question, as you might learn in elementary school or even through high school, in my question is the truth. So, he says here, uh, to argue that, you mean to argue that being, if it is many, so if being is not just one, but many, both must be like and unlike. And so being is like itself and not like itself. And the answer to this is yes, I do mean that, but by degrees. So within temperature, there is cold and there is hot. And cold and hot are opposite of each other, aren't they? Well, it depends. Yes, cold and hot are opposite of each other, but only at extreme degrees. And even then, not actually. The only time you really get cold and hot to be truly opposite of each other is in absolute temperature, let's say in kelvins. So absolute zero is opposite, or Celsius. Absolute zero is, or 0 Celsius is freezing, and 100 Celsius is boiling. Freezing and boiling are opposite each other, but if you touch something that's frozen and you touch something that's boiling, they both could cause you pain that feels hot. Let's say it can cause you burning. So when we say that being is opposite of itself, it is only in this is where Einstein's theory of relativity comes into play. It is only opposite in itself by degrees, only in speech, only so we can say I and you are different. So men and women, so you say all humans are the same. Well, men and women are all humans are the same. But men and women are different from each other. They are opposite of each other. Well, men and women are only opposite of each other in the sense that women are able to give birth and men are not able to give birth. And maybe there are other things as well, but overwhelmingly in their humanity, they share 98% of the same organs and abilities. And in that 2% where they don't share, is what we care about most, reproduction. We happen to care about reproduction, and therefore men and women are opposite. You are only opposite in that which you care about. And then everything is completely different from everything else. But in reality, if you were to measure men and women against each other, you would find an overwhelming similarity. But that's also the same if you were to compare uh, humanity and apes. If you compare an ape's genetic DNA and a man or human's genetic DNA, you'll find that 98% of it is similar. And but we don't, but we would offer, we may argue that as simians go, as simians go, humans and apes are opposite of each other. Because in that 2%, we consider the change between them to be so significant that we say relatively they are opposite. So understand that Socrates is drawing not an argument that says you're wrong or right, but he's trying to get his student, or at least the person he's speaking with, to admit to a logical fallacy. There's a logical fallacy in your argument of saying that things which that all that being is many and that being is opposite of itself. But you end up seeing that yes, being is many and it is one. And this is where they're getting to. So almost like a practice play as in a dialogue. Yes, being is many and it is opposite of itself. It is one. And so at some point, you'll get to the point where there is no logical fallacy. A law school is this way, where your professor may ask you, you're discussing a car crash. And is it true that, so car A uh, crashes into car B, and it is true in that state that every time a car crashes into the back of another car, the car that crashes into is responsible. And so your professor will say, so you'll say, well, car A crashed into car B, so car A is responsible for paying for this accident. And your professor will say, well, is that always the case? It is always the case, isn't it? That in this state, car A would pay for car B if it crashes into it. Yes, that's always the case. Well, instead of saying, is there a case where it isn't true? The professor will say, well, that doesn't make any sense. How is that even, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because it's the law of the state that's it. You crash your car A, you crash into car B, you're responsible. Whereas, so they'll either keep with you usually for some time, and if you kind of grow frustrated and angry, they'll grade you for that, and they'll move on to another person who will say, however, even though this is not in the law, there is a court case that shows that car A crashes into car B, but car B slams on their brakes for no reason. And so car B crashes into it. And in that case, since our case is similar to that, or could be, it may be that the law, which says whenever a car A crashes into a car B, that car A is responsible. In this case, there may be an exception. And so the professor may be at that point say, well, great, is that the case here? And then they'll go on kind of beyond a Socratic method of back and forth. If you're going back and forth, is that the case? Is that your argument? Are you really saying that? The person is really trying to get you to know that your argument has a logical fallacy. The professor may know what the fallacy is. They may know what is illogical about what you're saying, or the judge, or they may not know. But they know that A plus B equals C, except when A is a capital A, not a lowercase a. And so there's a rule here about logic, and you can hear in the way someone's arguing their statement that there's a fallacy there, but you don't know it, and they don't know it. But someone else may be able to say, and this is the fallacy. So this is what Socrates does, and this is the approach that we have here in this engagement. Because sometimes Socrates, and this is maybe what got him assassinated or put on trial, he turned instead of explaining his method of questioning, that is this the case? Are you sure this is the case? And then possibly teaching logic, as Plato would eventually do, he just kept poking at people and he was a foreigner in Athens. And in this community, there were ethics and etiquette that had to be followed, and how you speak with certain officials based on their rank in society, so that at least for the 4 to 8 years they held that rank, they would maintain their full authority and benefit all the people. So if you go around yelling and screaming, or at least embarrassing the chief judge in a way that it's clearly you're just trying to show off your particular understanding, well, there's a logical fallacy there. Instead of just saying, Your Honor, you have made a logical mistake. The principles of logic say that there are exceptions to rules, and actually, exceptions prove the rule. These few exceptions that there are make it clear that the rule that we hold on to, that being is like and unlike, which is a contradiction. Well, there are exceptions to this, which remove the contradiction. That proves that being, and that proves the rule that we're after. It proves it. Instead of doing that, you just keep, I would argue, playing a game, a mental game. People are watching you. Language is powerful, and then you undermine a person, and it's considered trickery. Not everyone is your student, and you can't just sit there and attack them with these puzzles. Here's a new puzzle. Here's a new Sudoku. Here's a new uh, concern that you should think about. When you do that, a person gets very annoyed. And even if you have a point that could save all of humanity, you won't get it because you're not following etiquette. You won't get to achieve it because you're not following etiquette, and you may be harmed at the same time. So remember, in speech, that if you break etiquette in speech, it doesn't often matter if you're right. But if you need to say something and you need to break etiquette, you need to do so quickly and say, well, here is my point, here's what I mean, and here is the impact it'll have on everyone. You are the person responsible and the most powerful person who can do it. So flattery is there. Please do this. And then it can be done. In some societies, it is common that people argue back and forth and make fun of each other. And if that is your etiquette, as it was in Sodom and Gomorrah, where instead of going into a court and making a valid argument to free a person from their bondage, you had to go in and uh, split a guy's forehead open. And if you did that in front of the judge, then you won your case. This was a Spartan community, and you'll find this narration in the book of Jasher around chapter 17. Okay, so going back to their argument, to deceive the world by saying the same thing is entirely to deceive the world by saying the same thing in entirely different forms is a strain of art beyond most of us. Yes, Socrates, said Zenu, but though you are as keen as a Spartan hound, you do not quite catch the motive of the piece, which was only intended to protect Parmenides against ridicule by showing that the hypothesis of the existence of the many involved greater absurdities than the hypothesis of the one. The book was a youthful composition of mine, which was stolen from me, and therefore I had no chance about the publication. I quite believe you, said Socrates, but will you answer me a question? I should like to know whether you would assume an idea of likeness in the abstract, which is the contradictory of unlikeness, in the abstract by participation in either or both of which things are like or unlike or partly both. For the same thing may very well partake of like and unlike in the concrete, though like and unlike in the abstract are irreconcilable. For short, uh, if we're talking about building the building, yes, like and unlike can be somewhat like each other. There can be degrees. But if we're just talking abstractly, we should go further and really distinguish between like and unlike and make them absolute. Nor does there appear to me to be any absurdity in maintaining that the same things may partake of the one and many, though I should be indeed surprised to hear that the absolute one is also many. For example, I, being many, that is to say, having many parts or members, am yet also one and partake of the one, being one of seven who are here present, compare Philebus. This is not an absurdity, but a truism. But I should be amazed if there were a single entanglement in the nature of the ideas themselves, nor can I believe that one and many, like and unlike rest and motion, in the abstract are capable either of admixture or of separation. Pythodorus said that in his opinion, Parmenides and Zeno were not very well pleased at the questions which were raised. Nevertheless, they looked at one another and smiled, in seeming delight and admiration of Socrates. Tell me, said Parmenides, do you think that the abstract ideas of likeness, unity, and the rest exist apart from individuals which partake of them? And is this your own distinction? I think that there are such ideas, and would you make abstract ideas of the just, the beautiful, the good? Yes, he said, and of human beings like ourselves, of water, fire, and the like. I am not certain, and would you be undecided about and would you be undecided also about ideas of which the mention will, perhaps, appear laughable, of hair, mud, filth, and other things which are base and vile? No, Parmenides, visible things like these are, as I believe, only what they appear to be, though I am sometimes disposed to imagine that there is nothing without an idea. But I repress any such notion from a fear of falling into an abyss of nonsense. Hair, mud, filth at the molecular level are extremely similar to one another, even though they appear different, and at the non quantum level have different usages and assigned preferences. Continue. You are young, Socrates, and therefore naturally regard the opinions of men. The time will come when philosophy will have a firmer hold of you, and you will not despise even the meanest things. But tell me, is your meaning that things become like by partaking of likeness, great by partaking of greatness, just and beautiful by partaking of justice and beauty, and so of other ideas? Yes, that is my meaning. And do you suppose the individual to partake of the whole or of the part? Why not of the whole? Said Socrates. Because, said Parmenides, in that case the whole, which is one, will become many. Nay, said Socrates, the whole may be like the day, which is one and in many places. In this way, the idea may be one and also many. In the same sort of way, said Parmenides, as a sail, which is one, may be a cover to many. That is your meaning? Yes. And would you say that each man is covered by the whole sail, or by a part only? By a part? Then the ideas have parts, and the objects partake of a part of them only. That seems to follow. And would you like to say that the ideas are really divisible and yet remain one? Certainly not. Would you venture to affirm that great objects have a portion only of greatness transferred to them, or that small or equal objects are small or equal because they are only portions of smallness or equality? Impossible. But how can individuals participate in ideas except in the ways which I have mentioned? That is not an easy question to answer. I should imagine the conception of ideas to arise as follows. You see great objects pervaded by a common form or ideas of greatness, which you abstract. That is quite true. And supposing you embrace in one view the idea of greatness thus gained, and the individuals which it comprises, a further idea of greatness arises, which makes both great. And this may go on to infinity. Socrates replies that the idea may be thoughts in the mind only. In this case, the consequence would no longer follow. But must not the thought be of something which is the same in all and is the idea? And if the world partakes in the ideas, and the ideas are thoughts, must not all things think? Or can thought be without thought? I acknowledge the unmeaningness of this, says Socrates, and would rather have recourse to the explanation that the ideas are types in nature and that other things partake of them by becoming like them. But to become like them is to comprehend in the same idea, and the likeness of the idea and the individuals implies another idea of likeness, and another without end. Quite true. The theory then of participation by likeness has to be given up. You have hardly yet, Socrates, found out the real difficulty of maintaining abstract ideas. What difficulty? The greatest of all, perhaps, is this. An opponent will argue that the ideas are not within the range of human knowledge, and you cannot disprove the assertion without a long and laborious demonstration, which he may be unable or unwilling to follow. In the first place, neither you nor any one who maintains the existence of absolute ideas will affirm that they are subjective. That would be a contradiction. True, and therefore any relation in these ideas is a relation which concerns themselves only, and the objects which are named after them are relative to one another only, and have nothing to do with the ideas themselves. How do you mean? Said Socrates. I may illustrate my meaning in this way. One of us has a slave, and the idea of a slave in the abstract is relative to the idea of a master in the abstract. This correspondence of ideas, however, has nothing to do with the particular relation of our slave to us. Do you see my meaning? Perfectly. And absolute knowledge is the same way, and absolute knowledge in the same way corresponds to absolute truth and being, and particular knowledge to particular truth and being. Clearly. And there is a subjective knowledge which is of subjective truth, having many kinds, general and particular, but the ideas themselves are not subjective, and therefore are not within our ken. They are not. Then the beautiful and the good in their own nature are unknown to us. It would seem so. There is a worse consequence yet. Just before going on, what was that about? Uh, he says to Socrates, you have some difficulty holding, or there is a great difficulty, and you experience it in holding abstract ideas in your head, meaning uh, happiness is for everyone, or democracy is the way of the land. And Socrates is saying, well, what difficulty do I have as a student? Maybe he's 20 at university. What difficulty do I have in holding abstract ideas? The difficulty you have is that you want to talk to people who are older than you, like ourselves. And maybe we don't have all the patience for you that you need to get over your ideas. And the why of that is because he does have some patience, because I know every idea you have came from that university and that you memorized them and that you are in your third year course and this is all that you know to argue. But let me tell you something, you live here in Athens. This is where you are. We have a certain system and we don't have, not everyone has your education. So you may try to have this argument with other people and you won't get anywhere. So let me just let you know that the course you're pursuing, if you pursue it with the wrong people, will end in your ruin. So you can have your abstract ideas and pursue them, but if you do so without etiquette, you're going to be harmed, is what he's saying to him. But he's also giving him a certain education. There is a worse consequence yet. What is that? I think we must admit that absolute knowledge is the most exact knowledge, which we must therefore attribute to God. But then see what follows. God, having his exact knowledge, can have no knowledge of human things, as we have divided the two spheres and forbidding any passing from one to the other. The gods have knowledge and authority in their world only, as we have in ours. Yet surely to deprive God of knowledge is monstrous. These are some of the difficulties which are involved in the assumption of absolute ideas. The learner will find them nearer the learner will find them nearly impossible to understand, and the teacher who has to impart them will require superhuman ability. There will always be a suspicion either that they have no existence or are beyond human knowledge. There I agree with you, said Socrates. Yet if these difficulties induce you to give us Yet, if these difficulties induce you to give up universal ideas, what becomes of the mind? And where are the reasoning and reflecting powers? Philosophy is at an end. I certainly do not see my way. I think, said Parmenides, that this arises out of your attempting to define abstractions such as the good and the beautiful and the just before you have had sufficient previous training. I noticed your deficiency when you were talking to Arist- Aristoteles the day before yesterday. Your enthusiasm is a wonderful gift, but I fear that unless you discipline yourself by dialectic while you are young, truth will elude your grasp. And what kind of discipline would you recommend? The training which you heard Zenu practicing. At the same time, I admire your saying to him that you did not care to consider the difficulty in reference to visible objects, but only in relation to ideas. Yes, because I think that in visible objects you may easily show any number of inconsistent consequences. Yes, and you should consider not only the consequences which follow from a given hypothesis, but the consequences also which follow from the denial of the hypothesis. There's one thing to be able to have an argument over an idea that someone puts out there. So we are going to build 10 new bridges over connecting these 10 cities. I think that's a dumb idea. We don't have enough money for that, and if we do that, it's going to take a lot of labor, and we have to do it in the summer. Or more recently, well, we'll go with that one. So, in that respect, uh, you may have a lot of good reasons why it shouldn't occur, but you may not have an idea of why these are being built, how many jobs they'll create, what it means to connect these cities from a cultural standpoint, and to go against a hypothesis. Say you are the president's son and you go against it, then you undermine him, and there are all of these other human etiquette factors that you break. And in breaking that etiquette, you've offered an idea that won't be successful, and you've undermined an important person, possibly your father. And in undermining your father, he may lose his job and you're well to go to school, or then you'll be stuck in your place. So it's not that you can't offer your ideas, but think about it. Is my attack on this particular hypothesis uh, to my benefit? And if I am harmed by it, will I eventually accomplish something ethical or at least material from it? And if you won't, it is better to not offer it in the first place or to write it down in the book and wait for the right time to offer it. Or ask someone else who has less to lose if he or she will offer it instead of you. For example, what follows from the assumption of the existence of the many and the counter argument of what follows from the denial of the existence of the many, and similarly of likeness and unlikeness, motion, rest, generation, corruption, being and not being, and the consequences must include consequences to the things supposed and to other things in themselves and in relation to one another, to individuals whom you select, to the many and to the all. These must be drawn out both on the affirmative and on the negative hypothesis. That is, if you are to train yourself perfectly to the intelligence of the truth. If you are to train yourself perfectly to the intelligence of the truth, if that's your goal, if your goal is to walk around annoying important men and preventing them from thinking or confusing them, you can continue. If your goal is to gather a bunch of young people around you and be called their corrupter, that's something. If your goal is to wander about and collect money because you speak so well and people enjoy having these arguments with you because you make them seem smarter, but if you are to train yourself perfectly to the intelligence of truth, this is the way to go about it and going forward. What you are suggesting seems to be a tremendous process, and of one which I do not quite understand the nature, said Socrates. Would you give me an example? So he's curious about this new method. So from approaching these people to sell them his ideas, he's now going to be sold ideas that as a young man he will in part carry forward with him into the future. You must not impose such a task on a man of my years, said Parmenides. Then will you, Zeno? Let us rather, said Zeno, with a smile, ask Parmenides for the understanding is a serious one, as he truly says. Nor could I urge him to make the attempt, except in a select audience of persons who will understand him. The whole party joined in the request. So uh, Socrates, after being really annoying, at least from an etiquette standpoint, being a young person asking questions, but still wanting to learn. So, okay, you said if I really want the truth, then I have to ask about it. And Parmenides is saying, I'm too old. I'm too important. I'm Once you learn from me, you have a certain ability to teach others. I don't think I want to do that with you, but not an outright rejection. So Socrates does something very intelligent. He makes an appeal to someone that Parmenides loves, his good friend Zeno. And Zeno says, in a way, the same thing. Well, not for you, Socrates, but there are seven of us here, correct? And it may be that the other four and myself, Zenu, want to hear this ourselves, and that Parmenides, who's hosting us, may very well want to teach it to us. So if you happen to be here while the reading's happening, then we probably can go along. So let's see if everyone else wants it. And the whole party joined in the request. Here we have, first of all, an unmistakable attack made by the youthful Socrates on the paradoxes of Zeno. He perfectly understands their drift, and Zeno himself is supposed to admit this, but they appear to him, as he says in Philebus also, to be rather truisms than paradoxes. For every one must acknowledge the obvious fact that the body being one has many members, and that in a thousand ways the like partakes of the unlike, the many of the one. So the like partakes of the unlike. I am like another another person who's gone to law school, and he is like another person who has gone to law school. We are a likeness of each other. I, though, am unlike a person who has gone to medical school, and so I partake in being like another and being unlike another, either absolutely or by degrees. I am a singular person made up of many units. I am also an American, one of 350 million or so, making up one. So I'm a singularity made up of many, and I am one of many, and I am of many that makes up a one. And so this is a way to begin thinking about this without being too um, without being too drunk on the beautiful language. But this was a problem which the Eleatic philosophers had never considered. Their thoughts had not gone beyond the contradictions of matter, motion, space, and the like. It was no wonder that Parmenides and Zeno should hear the novel speculations of Socrates with mixed feelings of admiration and displeasure. He was going out of the received circle of disputation into a region in which they could hardly follow him. From the crude idea of being in the abstract, he was about to proceed to universals or general notions. There is no contradiction in material things partaking of the ideas of one and many, neither is there any contradiction in the ideas of one and many, like and unlike in themselves. But the contradiction arises when we attempt to conceive ideas in their connection or to ascertain their relation to phenomena. Still, he affirms the existence of such ideas, and this is the position which is now in turn submitted to the criticism of Parmenides. So, why is there a contradiction in trying to conceive ideas in their connection? There's a contradiction because there is no logic. If you have logic, you can know how A and B uh, effectively lead to C, or why A and B don't lead to C unless you add X to it. So without logic, without an understanding of how things do connect, if you have a three-prong uh, plug to go into the wall and you're in the United Kingdom, it is possible that it won't work. Or if you have a 220 volt shaver that you want to use in the United States, it is possible that it won't work. Now, that shaver works, that plug works, but not where you want to put it. And so the argument that Socrates is making is this shaver does work and it does shave a face, but you have to find the right connection to cause it to work. You have to find the right, let's say, Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or other connection for something to actually work. And if you don't do that, then it won't work. But it doesn't mean that the thing itself isn't useful. It just means that you don't know how to use it. So if someone isn't familiar with different types of plugs in different countries, you would say, I want to explain to you what a computer is. And they'll say, okay, well, show it to us. I can't because my computer requires me to plug up into a certain type of plug. And we don't have it here, but we only have limited time. So let me tell you what a computer is. And then when I have a better plug, so to speak, I'll either come back and show you, or now that you know what a computer is, you'll ask, okay, I want a computer. It is it it turns on. It allows you to connect to the internet, and apparently it doesn't plug into every plug. The plugs aren't universal. Is there any way you can give me a computer that also works here? And that's what we're heading to do. I want knowledge that works where I am, but I also want to obtain knowledge that can work anywhere if I make certain modifications to power it. Back to the text. To appreciate truly the character of these criticisms, we must remember the place held by Parmenides in the history of Greek philosophy. He is the founder of idealism and also of dialectic, or in modern phraseology, of metaphysics and logic. Theat and Soph, like Plato, he is struggling after something wider and deeper than satisfied the contemporary Pythagoreans. And Plato, with a true instinct, recognizes him as his spiritual father, whom he revered and honored more than all other philosophers together. He may be supposed to have thought more than he said or was able to express. And although he could not, as a matter of fact, have criticized the ideas of Plato without an anachronism, the criticism is appropriately placed in the mouth of the founder of the ideal philosophy. Once a man said to me, I will be your spiritual father. And before teaching me the knowledges of Aristotle as they'd been understood by the Arabs. And I replied to him, well, I never, my father and mother live in different places. And so I haven't really had a deep experience with my father. I can't appreciate what it means that you'll be my spiritual father. If anything, I don't see it as a positive thing. And so, until this very moment, and having a definition of a spiritual father absent the notion of a biological father, whether you had a great biological father or not, or whether he was close or not, I can now say so a spiritual father is one who is revered and honored more than all other philosophers together. And then I know what he meant by when he said that, without necessarily referring back to my own relationship. But at that time, the connection didn't make sense. It didn't work, and it would either he would have to state it a different way, or I would have to come to this particular phrase to know better what it means. So that's the universal principle of a spiritual father, but also understanding that the experience of fatherness may be different for different people. There was probably a time in the life of Plato when the ethical teachings of Socrates came into conflict with the metaphysical theories of the earlier philosophers, and he sought to supplement the one by the other. The older philosophers were great and awful, and they had the charm of antiquity. Something which found a response in his own mind seems to have been lost as well as gained in the Socratic dialect. He in the Socratic dialectic. He felt no incongruity in the veteran Parmenides correcting the youthful Socrates. 2 points in his criticism are especially deserving of notice.